Good evening, guys. Welcome back to the final night of our events week. We're really excited to bring this final session to you. Well done to make it to the end of the week. It's been really great. My name's Caitlin. I'm a first year social work student at RGU. And tonight I'm joined with Sam, who's our other host, and Michael.
Yeah, so I'm Sam. I'm a third year English student, and yeah, like Caitlin said, we have Michael Ots here with us tonight, speaking on the idea of hope for the future. Can we have hope for the future? So, Michael, just to get to know you a bit, whereabouts in the world are you tonight?
Thanks, Sam. So right now, I'm living in Marlow, which is in Buckinghamshire, which is about 30 minutes west of Heathrow Airport. This is where I've lived for the last 6 months since, 5 months since getting married. So I live here with my wife. Before that, I lived in Bournemouth down on the south coast. I grew up in Leicester, but I actually studied in Scotland, in Edinburgh, which is great.
Brilliant. And what is it you usually do when when life is normal? What is it you usually do?
Normal life. What was that? It's like a distant dream, isn't it? So I have the joy really of speaking at events organised by university Christian unions, not just here in the UK, but all over Europe and sometimes even further afield from that. So normally that would be obviously physically in a lecture room, in a cafe, somewhere on campus. Looking at some of the big questions of life, looking at how the Christian faith engages with some of those big questions, like we've been doing this week, like we'll do tonight. And that's a real joy to do that. Obviously, not so much recently, given the lack of travel. So I was just saying, my wife's an airline pilot, and this is the most we've been at home ever, probably in our lives since we were kids. So it's a bit of a different life for us.
Yeah. How's it been treating you, the lockdown life?
Yeah, it's been a mixture. I guess there's some things that are lovely about it. We've been blessed with amazing weather down here, so I've loved going out cycling on really quiet roads. We live in a lovely block of flats with communal gardens, and we've really loved getting to know our neighbours. And bizarrely, we've actually got to know our neighbours far more through lockdown than we ever did before lockdown began. So that's been really nice. And I've enjoyed just having a kind of quieter, kind of less rushed time. But I guess there's anxieties thrown into that as well. So as I said, my wife's an airline pilot. She works for British Airways, and her job is very much in question at the moment. So living with uncertainties and questions of what's going to happen to her job, what will that mean for us if she doesn't continue in that. So it's kind of a nice time tinged with anxieties. And I guess probably for many people, we can identify with that. There's some things about this that we probably like, and there'll be other things that we absolutely hate. It's been a mixed time, hasn't it?
Yeah, for sure. Great. Just before you kick us off, Michael, I just want to let everyone watching know that throughout the talk, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask Michael, we'll have a period of Q&A after his main talk. So if you're watching on the Facebook stream, feel free to put in a question in the comments there, or there should be a link to Slido, which you can go on and ask questions through that. Afterwards as well, if you have, if you want to follow up on any questions, or you have any more questions to ask, we'll be on a Zoom call with Michael later on and a few other folks to essentially, have a bit more of a informal chat, a bit more one-to-one. If you feel like you want to go a bit further with questions. And we are also kind of running a few sessions over the next few weeks. Basically, if you have been along to the talks this week, feel interested about Christianity, want to explore a bit more, want to explore the Bible a bit more, there should be a link for you to be able to sign up to receive a digital copy of a book of the Bible, the Gospel of Mark. It's an autobiography of Jesus' life, and be able to sign up for that and to read it with someone from one of the Christian unions. Essentially, again, just relaxed, informal kind of setting, just to explore it a bit more and kind of, explore your questions a bit more. So, without further ado, Michael, kick us off.
Thanks so much, Sam. Well, it's great to be with you. Thank you so much for this invitation. And when I was talking to someone just earlier and they said, "Where are you going tonight?" I said, "Well, I'm going to Scotland." Unfortunately, not physically. Both my wife and I would love to be in Scotland tonight physically, partly because she is Scottish. We got married in Glasgow in January, which it turns out to be the best month of the year to get married in 2020 at least. I guess no one expected what's been happening to happen. It's great to be with you, even if it's obviously online. And as Sam has said, there's going to be time for questions at the end. We would really do appreciate your questions. So please don't feel at all embarrassed to ask your questions, to disagree if you do, or to ask follow-up questions. A talk like this will probably provoke many questions, and there's far more that could be said about a topic like this than maybe we have time to in the next 20 minutes. So we'd love to hear your engagement in that way. And if you go into Slido, you can see other people's questions too. Vote them up if you think they're a good question. I'm afraid you can't vote them down if you think they're a bad question, but you can just ask what you might think is a better question. That would be a better thing to do. But I don't know about you, over the last few weeks, one of the things I've found about this whole period of pandemic and lockdown has been the way that I've become almost addicted to news updates. It's not that I didn't kind of look at the news before coronavirus came along. Of course I did. But there is something about this current period that makes me addicted to my phone in a way that I wouldn't be at other times. I look on the BBC, I look on Sky, I look on all sorts of news outlets. And I ask myself from time to time, why is it that we do this? Why do we seem so addicted to checking the news every few minutes? It's not like things necessarily have changed since 10 minutes ago. Why this near addiction to checking news updates? And I guess there's maybe two reasons. Firstly, we want information, don't we? When global events have such a direct and massive implication on our lives and our freedoms and our futures, we want to know what's going on. That's perfectly normal. But I wonder if there's more to it than that. I wonder if it's also because what we're really looking for when we keep checking the latest updates is we're really looking for hope. We're really looking for light at the end of the tunnel. We're really looking for a glimmer of hope. We want to know when we're going to be able to see friends again, when we're going to be able to see family again, and we're going to be able to hug those nephews or nieces, those family members. We want to know when the football season is going to restart. We want to know if Liverpool are going to win the title. We want to know when we're going to be able to travel. We want to know, I guess, ultimately, when things are going to go back to normal. Isn't that what we kind of long for? We long for the kind of world we lived in a few months ago that wasn't so turned upside down like the world we live in is at the moment. But actually, I guess I'd also want to say this. Is it that we just want the world to go back to the way it was? Do we just want things to go back to normal? Let's just imagine for a minute that 2020 had worked out differently, that 2020 was a year that had no coronavirus. None of us had even heard of it. It had not happened. Of course, many things would not have happened. 360,000 people globally may not have died, or at least not of coronavirus, certainly. Many people wouldn't have lost their jobs, and we wouldn't be living with this massive degree of uncertainty about the future and what the future holds. But of course, even if coronavirus hadn't happened, we would still be living in a world this year where probably about 3 million children would have died of preventable diseases. Would have still been living in a world that had massive injustices, where the events that we've seen in the last few days in Minneapolis would have played out tragically on our TV screens. Would have still been living in a world where cancer exists. Would have still been living in a world where friends of mine would have lost their 25-year-old daughter to cancer, as they did just a few weeks ago. And we'd still be living in a world where 56 million people or thereabouts would have died. So although we might want the world to go back to the way it was before all this coronavirus thing happens, it's not just that we want it to go back, is it? Isn't there part of us that wants it to be even better? We don't just want a world without coronavirus, we want a world without cancer. We don't just want a world without coronavirus, we want a world without injustice, without death, without sadness, without tears, without partings. We long for a world that is a better world than the one that we've experienced anyway. And I guess the question we're looking at tonight is that kind of hope real? Is there hope that this world could not just go back to the way it was? Hopefully that will to a degree happen. But is there hope that our world in some ways could go to a future that is better than we've ever imagined or ever experienced? Is there hope for our world? And I guess how you answer that question really depends on your worldview or your belief system. You may not call yourself religious, but all of us have a belief system. All of us have a way of looking at life and the world. And that will affect how we look at the future. Is there hope for the future? Well, let's look at atheism, materialism for a moment. Does atheism hold out hope for the future? Well, it kind of depends which atheists you speak to. If you spoke to an atheist like Steven Pinker, you would discover that he would say, yes, atheism does hold out real hope for the future. Steven Pinker, in his book Enlightenment Now, basically says the world is getting better, and he produces lots of fascinating graphs and statistics to back up his points. And then he says the reason why the world is getting better is that we've got rid of religion, we've got rid of superstitious God stuff, and we've embraced science and rational reason. That's why the world is getting better. Now, I would say Steven Pinker makes a very good case for explaining why in many cases the world has actually got better from the way it was, say, 100 or 200 years ago. There's far less child mortality. There's actually far less conflict in some ways. Yes, there are many ways in which the world has got better. Although whether that is because we've got rid of religion is another question. In fact, that's one we might come back to a little bit later on. But I guess the deeper question I want to ask is this. Whilst we might be able to say the world is better than it was 100 years ago, and we might hold out hope that in 100 years' time, certain things will be better than they are now, does an atheistic worldview give you an ultimate hope for the future? You see, ultimately, atheism says that this life is all there is, and death is the end. It's the end for me, it's the end for you. Ultimately, it'll be the end for everything and for everyone, and ultimately, not just for everything, but for the universe itself. Another atheist of a previous generation was Bertrand Russell. And Bertrand Russell, speaking about this, said very provocatively, but I would suggest actually very consistently with his worldview, this. He says, all the labours of the ages, all the devotion and all the inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius are destined to extinction in the vast death of the solar system. The whole temple of man's achievement must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of the universe in ruins. All these things, if not quite beyond dispute, are yet nearly so certain that no philosophy which rejects them can hope to stand. And then he says this, get this, only within the scaffolding of these truths, only on the firm foundation of unyielding despair, can the soul's habitation henceforth be safely built. Pretty bleak, you might say, but actually he was saying that's where the materialistic worldview takes you. It is bleak, he says. Ultimately, whilst we may have glimmers of hope, if we look at the big picture, it's heading in one direction and it's not pretty. So atheism in the big grand scheme of things doesn't give us great reasons to hope for our world. Yes, in the short term, things might get a little bit better or they might get a little bit worse, but in the long term, there is no hope. Well, what about religion then, you might say? Doesn't religion offer hope? Well, of course, many religions do talk about a life that goes on beyond death. And they talk about places that people might go to beyond death, whether that is nirvana or paradise or heaven or some spiritual dimension. And certainly that does give a great sense of hope and meaning to many people who are religious. But is that hope for our world? And I would actually want to say it's not. You see, the hope that religion so often offers is not hope for this world, but rather it's a hope for escape from this world. The hope that religion offers is that one day we'll leave this broken, sad, and messed up world and we will go to another world, another place, another dimension. And whilst that might give us a sense of consolation in the face of a troubled and broken world, it's not actually hope for this world, is it? Ultimately, in such worldviews, this world is going to be discarded, destroyed. And if that is the case, then what's the point of everything we do in this life now? What's the point of our studies at university? What's the point of our achievements? What's the point of trying to make a difference to this world if ultimately this world is going to be destroyed too? It's like, as someone said, just changing the ordering of the seats on the deck of the Titanic. It's all going down. What's the point? And I want to say, unsurprisingly, you might suggest, that as a Christian, there is a unique sense of hope that the Christian worldview and the Christian faith brings that is different to atheism, but also different to our preconceptions of religion. You see, Christianity says the hope that we have in Jesus is not a hope of escape from this world to some other kind of dimension, but Christianity offers a hope for this world. See, the Christian hope isn't that we leave this world and go off to a cloud and play a harp and go to choir practice and wear white nighties that have been washed in some extremely good washing liquid. The Christian hope is ultimately for the transformation of this world. So interestingly, the Bible doesn't go on about heaven and hell in the way that we might think. The Bible goes on about heaven and earth. And it talks about a day when heaven and earth will be united. And this world will be transformed and set free. So the Christian hope is not just a spiritual hope for the spiritual side of life, but the Christian hope is a physical hope too. It is about the renewal, the transformation of everything. And it's a beautiful, beautiful hope. And I think one of the people who both most imaginatively described what that hope is like is actually C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis, famous mostly for writing the Narnia stories, the Chronicles of Narnia. And in that Chronicles series, the last book is a book called The Last Battle. It's a beautiful story that really pictures the hope of Christianity in a kind of fictional work of literature. At the end of the story, the children that we followed through the 7 books have died. And they think it's the end of the story. They think that everything has been destroyed. Narnia, this beautiful world that they've grown to know and love, has been put out, as it were, and has been completely destroyed. And then they find themselves in this new world. And they find themselves looking around them at the mountains and the rivers and the valleys. And they have this conversation. Let me just read it to you because it's a really beautiful little part of the story. "Peter," said Lucy, "where is this, do you suppose?" "I don't know," said the High King. "It reminds me of somewhere, but I can't give it a name. Could it be somewhere we once stayed for a holiday when we were very, very small?" "It would have had to be a very jolly good holiday," said Eustace. "I bet there isn't a country like this in our world. Look at the colours. You couldn't get a blue like that on those mountains in our world." "Isn't it Aslan's country?" said Tyrion. "Well, not like Aslan's country on top of the mountain beyond the eastern end of the world," said Jill. "I've been there." "Well, if you ask me," said Edmund, "it's like somewhere in the Narnian world. Look at those mountains ahead, the big ice mountains beyond them. Surely they're rather like the mountains we used to see from Narnia, the ones up westward beyond the waterfall." "Yes, so they are," said Peter, "only these are bigger." "Oh, I don't think those are anything like Narnia," said Lucy, "but look there." She pointed southwards to their left, and everyone stopped and turned to look. "Those hills," said Lucy, "the nice woody ones and the blue ones behind, aren't they very like the southern border of Narnia?" "Like?" cried Edmund after a moment's silence. "Why, they're exactly like. Look, there's Mount Pyre with its forked head. There's the pass into Archenland and everything." "And yet they're not like," said Lucy. "They're different. They have more colours on them and they look further away, and I don't know." "They look more like the real thing," said the Lord Diggory softly. Suddenly Farsight the eagle spread his wings, spread 30 or 40 feet into the air, circled round and alighted on the ground. "Kings and queens," he cried, "we've all been so blind. We're only beginning to see where we are. From up there I have seen it all. Narnia is not dead. This is Narnia." And it's this beautiful moment in the stories where these children who thought that the world that they had lived in and loved had been destroyed, discover that actually far from being destroyed, it has been transformed. And it is not less real, but it is more real and more wonderful than the Narnia that they've left. And in fact, C.S. Lewis often described the world as it is at the moment as simply the Shadowlands, because he said actually the Christian hope says the real deal is what is yet to come. It is the transformation. It is the renewal of all things. It is an incredible hope. Now, having said all that, I guess there may be 3 questions or objections that might come to your mind before we go to the other questions that you might have. And the first is this: well, isn't that just pie in the sky? I mean, yes, beautiful, nice to read literature, but how does that change my life today? Isn't this just burying your head in the sand and just hoping that all the problems will go away? Shouldn't we try and embrace the realities of the world as it is now rather than dreaming about this paradise in the future? That's one objection. I guess the second objection is, well, isn't this all some Freudian illusion? Isn't this some wish fulfillment that we've created to deal with our stark realities of a broken world? But it doesn't really exist. There isn't really a world like that to come. It's just people believe it because they want it to be true. And I guess the third objection is this: well, if God could make a world like that, then why doesn't he do it now? Why do we live in a world that's inflicted with coronavirus and cancer and suffering? So just for the second part, I'd just like to spend a few moments on each of those objections and unpack them for a minute before we go to your questions after that. But let's take that first one. Isn't it just pie in the sky? Isn't this just burying your head in the ground? How does this hope that Christianity talks about for this ultimate future change our lives today? And what I want to say is that actually, far from making us detached from this broken and hurting world, the Christian hope for the future actually leads us to embrace and get involved in and seek to transform this broken and hurting world. Now, how is that the case? Well, let me give you one illustration. It may have been mentioned already this week, forgive me if it has. But Rodney Stark, in his book, The Rise of Christianity, explains how the Christian faith grew over the first few centuries after the life of Jesus in particular. Incredibly, in spite of opposition and persecution, Christianity spread rapidly right across the Roman Empire. And he says in the book, there were a number of reasons why that happened. One of them, interestingly, was the way that Christianity raised the profile of women in a very countercultural way in those first few centuries. But another thing that Rodney Stark talks about is the way Christians responded to the pandemics and plagues of that period. In the first few centuries of the first millennium AD, there were several plagues that swept through the Roman Empire with devastating impacts, really devastating impact. Up to a quarter or a third of the population of some of these cities was wiped out because of the plague. And yet, and this is documented even by the Roman Emperor Julian, Christians did something quite radical and unique. Instead of running for their lives and spreading the plague quite often with them, as people did, they stayed put in these plague-ridden cities and cared for those amongst their own Christian community who were sick and dying. But not only did they care for their own sick and dying, they also cared for others who were not part of the Christian community. And of course, that was a very risky thing to do, for staying in those kind of situations and caring for those who had the plague incurred a much higher probability of dying from it yourself. But interestingly, being cared for gave people a much higher probability of surviving the plague, up to 33% more likely, Stark says. So what does he say? He says, well, what happened was, at a time when the general population of the Roman Empire was dramatically decreasing, the population of the Christian church was increasing. Now, that was partly because Christians survived the plague more than others because they were cared for. But it was also because many people who were not Christians saw this incredible self-sacrificial love of the Christian community in risking their lives to care for them, and embraced the Christian faith as a result. Now, Rodney Stark asks a really interesting question. He says, why did Christians do that? Why did they risk their lives, often give their lives, to care for people in that kind of radical way? Was it that they were more brave and more courageous than other people in society? And his answer is actually no. He says the reason why Christians did that is that they were simply, like everyone else, being consistent with their worldview. You see, most people believe that death was the end. This life is where things really are at. And death seems the end of all that's real and meaningful. And if that's your worldview, then of course you'll do anything you can to avoid death. But Christians didn't have that worldview. Christians believed that death was not the end, that the best was yet to come, that this was, as C.S. Lewis talked about, just the Shadowlands. And if that's your belief system, then actually you may be willing to sacrifice even your life to help others. You see, this hope that Christians had in those first few centuries didn't lead them to bury their head in the sand and detach themselves from the problems they saw in the world outside, but it led them in incredibly self-sacrificial ways to embrace those problems and to make a difference, and to sacrifice even their lives to do that. Tom Holland is well, he's an actor, but the other Tom Holland I'm thinking about is a secular historian. And he wrote a fascinating book recently called Dominion. And it's basically saying how Christianity has impacted the Western world in particular over the last 2,000 years. Whereas Steven Pinker says it's in the Enlightenment and atheism that has changed our world, Tom Holland says actually it's the Christian faith that has. And this radical worldview that Christianity presents of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection has led people to transform our world for the good so often through history. You see, having this hope that we've talked about tonight doesn't lead you to forget about the world as it is now, but it should, rightly understood, take you out into that world, to want to make a difference, to want to change it. Now you might say, well, okay, but you don't have to be a Christian to do that. And of course you don't. There are people in the world who have no belief system at all, who have still made a difference, who still volunteer, who still give money and so forth. But let me just throw this out there. So often we are told in the Western world today that the ultimate philosophy, the ultimate purpose to life is to be happy. Ultimately, whatever makes you happy is what we should live for. But if that is your philosophy in life, yes, you may give some money if it makes you feel good. You may get involved in charitable works if you feel a bit happier about it. But will you really sacrifice your life? Well, you won't, will you? Because where's the happiness in that? And then think of some of the people who've really made a difference to our world. Think of someone like Martin Luther King and the civil rights movements. Did he do that just because it made him happy? Or did he do it because he had a hope that went beyond this broken world? A hope that nothing could take away? Well, actually, it was that. He spoke about it in that famous speech. Or think of someone like William Wilberforce, who fought through his life to bring about the abolition of slavery. Was it because it made him happy? Well, no, actually, it made him sick. In fact, it took his health and eventually his life. But he did it because he had a hope that one day this world was going to be changed. So what I want to say is this: Christian hope isn't just about what happens in the future. If you know what happens in the future, it should lead you to make a difference in this world today. It's not pie in the sky. It's really life transforming and world transforming. That's one objection. Here's another one though. You might be saying, well, isn't this just wishful thinking? Isn't this just, a nice idea? Isn't this just a case of, people believing it because they want it to be true? There's a fascinating film that Ricky Gervais directed and acted in called The Invention of Lying. And this film looks at this kind of hypothetical world where no one can lie, apart from him, the main character, a character called Mark. And he faces this situation where his mother is dying and she's scared of death because she knows that when she dies, that's it. There's nothing beyond death. And Mark, this character who has the unique ability in this world to lie, to say things that aren't true, decides to use that ability in this situation. And he says to his mother, he says, "Mother, when you die, don't worry, it's not the end, but you'll go to a place where all your friends are. And there'll be no suffering, and there'll be no sadness, and there'll be no pain, only happiness." And then with a smile on her face, she breathes her last and she dies with this incredible sense of hope. But the only problem is, of course, in the context of the whole film, the point that Ricky Gervais is making as a very convinced atheist is that is what that kind of hope is. It's just an illusion. It's just wishful thinking. It's the same thing that Freud talked about, just a projection of our longings into the heavens, but it's not really true. But my problem with that is this: if you're going to dismiss Christianity and the Christian hope as simply a wish fulfillment, you could turn it around and do the very same thing for atheism. If you're going to say the reason why people embrace Christianity's view of the future is that they want there to be a heaven and they want a future like that, could you not equally say that the reason why some people don't believe in that is because they don't want there to be a God or a day of judgment, and they don't want there to be an accountability for the things that they've done in their lives? Kind of cuts both ways, doesn't it? See, either way, it doesn't actually tell you what the future holds. It doesn't tell you what is actually true. So how do you know whether this Christian hope is true? How do you know whether it's more than just wish fulfillments? And the reason why we can know that is actually because the Christian hope for the future is based on an event in the past. See, if you look at the early Christians, they rooted and grounded and built their Christian faith on one event. And it was this, that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. So the early Christians were quite willing to say that if the physical resurrection of Jesus Christ did not happen, then the whole Christian faith falls apart. It falls down like a pack of cards. That is the foundation that Christianity is built upon. And they made that claim at a time when the eyewitnesses were still alive and all the evidence was still to hand. An outrageous claim to make, because it is a claim that we can investigate. This is not some idea, some philosophy, some illusion. This is based on historical events. And indeed, it is an event that we can investigate too and discover whether it's in fact true. Is Christianity based on truth or just an illusion? A friend of mine who studied at Bristol University a number of years ago at Easter time, as part of the Christian Union, put on an event for the whole university. It was called the Great Resurrection Debate. It's a fascinating event where they invited anyone in the university to take part. They wanted people to propose an explanation that explained away the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ, without reference, of course, to the resurrection itself. And so they took out a centre page spread in the student newspaper, and they explained some of the historical evidence that every scholar would agree upon, Jewish, Christian, or atheist. The fact that Jesus died on the cross, the fact that his tomb was empty 3 days later, the fact that his disciples were convinced that they had encountered him alive again and were willing to die for that belief, the fact that the lives of those followers was transformed by this conviction, and the fact that Christianity spread right across the Roman Empire within 20 or 30 years based on this radical and incredible claim. And they gave some sources and some explanation of where people could look into it further. And then what they did is they shortlisted the best responses, and they held a cheese and wine evening in the student union. And they invited the shortlisted entrants to give an explanation for 5 minutes of their case, to explain away the evidence of the resurrection. And then a High Court judge was going to adjudicate the winner and give out the prize. A couple of things happened that night that were fascinating. First thing that happened is that the man who won the prize, for a £500 prize, by the way, so it wasn't maybe that's why everyone entered, because it was such a good prize. But the man who won the prize, in his acceptance speech, said that actually he wasn't convinced himself by the argument that he had put forward. It was basically an argument that said that Jesus hadn't really died on the cross. He had just swooned and come back to being resuscitated, as it were, in the tomb. He said even he wasn't convinced by the argument, but he was very thankful for the money. The second thing that happened is the High Court judge who was adjudicating that evening, who, by the way, wasn't a Christian himself, said that none of the explanations that had been given that evening would have stood up in a court of law. None of them could satisfactorily explain the evidence that had been put forward. And then a third interesting thing happened a few weeks later. The student who won the prize actually became a committed Christian, because actually, as he looked at the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, he became compelled and convinced that the only thing that really explained it was the resurrection, that Jesus Christ was actually alive. And the idea that seemed so absurd and so ridiculous to him as a secular Western student just a few weeks before became the very basis of his belief and worldview. And I guess my challenge to you is this: in a few moments tonight, I'm not necessarily going to change your mind on something as big as this, but certainly at very least investigate, if you haven't before. Investigate this stupendous claim that has split history in two. And indeed, you can ask questions about it in a few moments' time. We'd love to hear them. But continue to look into it, because many people, as skeptical or not more than you, have done just that and have actually found the evidence really compelling. And if it's true, that sets Jesus apart as unique, the Christian faith apart as unique. And it says the Christian hope is not too good to be true, but it is good because it is true. It's based on something real. Hey, look, I'm nearly done, but one last question to look at, one last objection that you might have. And it's this: look, if this is the hope that we have, if this is the hope that Christianity offers, why doesn't God just do it now? Like, why doesn't he just step in? Why are we living in a world with coronavirus and cancer and injustice and death? If God can change the world, why doesn't he change the world? Is it because he doesn't care? And my answer to that would be not that he doesn't care, but actually because he does. But before God changes the world, the Bible actually says he wants to change us. See, let's imagine a world without coronavirus, a world without cancer, a world without disease or viruses, a world without earthquakes and tsunamis. Would that be a perfect world? Well, of course it wouldn't be. Because you can take away all these, what we might call natural evils. And there's plenty of other things that would still ruin this world: injustice and racism and conflicts. So if you really wanted to make a world, the world that we long for, the world as we hope it could one day be, how would we do that when it would have to be populated full of people like us who would mess it up? Because if we're really honest, the problems of our world are not just out there, they're also in here, aren't they? It's my selfishness and my greed, and sometimes my apathy, that contributes to the problems we see and the pain that we feel. And so the Bible says before God changes the world, actually he needs to do something else. He needs to change us. That change needs to begin in our hearts. And wonderfully in Christianity, that offer of change is real. Because at the heart of the Christian faith stands this offer of forgiveness. That the God of the universe stepped into this broken world and took upon himself all of our wrong and sin so that we could be forgiven. Our lives could be set free from that destructive side that so often spoils everything. But not only that, but by God's Spirit in our lives, we can be changed and transformed to become who in our very best moments we would want to be. The Christian faith offers this hope for transformation and change that begins right here and then spreads out into the world and one day will change everything. So does God care about our world? Yes, he does. And actually he cares about you and me. And he wants to hold out this offer of transformation and change to us, that this hope might be our hope, that this future might be our future. So as I wrap up, I guess I just want to ask the question, what do you make of all this? Maybe you've been watching a number of the talks over the last week. It may well be that you're still skeptical about what you've heard. And if that's the case, thanks so much for sticking with us and for engaging with this. It's been great to have your company over these evenings. But if you are, why not look into it more? You see, if you're going to reject the Christian hope and the Christian vision of the future, where else are you going to base your hope for the future? Where else are you going to find that? And what are you going to do with the person of Jesus and the evidence for him? At least investigate it and look into it. Why not take one of those eyewitness accounts of the life of Jesus? We'll tell you more about how you can do that later. We've got a thing called Uncover, which takes one of the gospel accounts, one of the eyewitness accounts of Jesus' life, written by a guy called Mark, and it just helps you to look into this. It's a great way to start by looking at some of the first-hand, first-century evidence. Maybe you're saying, actually, I'm not skeptical, I'm curious, I'd like to look into this more. Again, there's opportunities to look into this kind of stuff, to ask questions, and in a moment there'll be time to do that as well. But it may well be that as you've listened tonight, maybe over the course of this week, you're saying, actually, I think this could be true. And this actually does seem to make sense of reality. But how could I know this hope for myself? And we would just want to say, you can. Because this hope is offered to us not as a reward, but as a gift. It's not something we need to deserve because we don't, but it's something we can receive as a gift from God. And we just want to say, if you've never received that gift, the transforming life that God can bring to you, then why not ask him to do that for you? Why not tonight talk to God and ask him not only to take away the stuff in our lives that's wrong, to forgive us, but then by his Spirit to come into our lives and to start to change us. And he promises to do that if we ask him to do that. And this night, this week could be a life-transforming week for you. And again, we'd love to be in touch with you and help you know how you can get started in that new life with Jesus at the heart of it and with this incredible future to look forward to. So again, I think we'll let you know about how you can be in touch in a few moments' time. But thanks so much for sticking with us. Sorry that was a bit longer than 20 minutes. I get very excited talking about hope and it's hard to stop. But I'll hand back to our hosts and we'll go to questions in a moment.
Thank you very much, Michael. That was great. So yeah, please do have a think about what was just said. There is a link for Slido in the comments of this live stream. Please do get your thoughts out there, your opinions, your feelings. We'd love to hear them and we'd love to answer as much as we can or have Michael answer as much as he can. So we do have one question from last night, but it ties into what you're saying. And it's, I do not think being atheist means you're hopeless. The future being unknown creates hope each day. And each day you're given the chance to spread love even without a faith.
Yeah, okay, good question. So do you have to be a Christian to have hope? I guess it depends on what level we're talking about hope. In a sense, without any hope, it would be very hard to get up in the morning. Hope for the future is what drives our lives, isn't it? Would you continue to go to lectures? Well, obviously you're not going to lectures at the moment, but would you continue to study and to partake in your studies at university if you knew at the end of the day there was going to be no degree, no job, nothing to show for it? Probably wouldn't, would you? So in a sense, everything we do in life is driven by some kind of hope for the future. If we have a job, often that comes from the hope not only of what we can contribute and the difference we can make, but also the hope that we might get paid for it at the end of the day too. So yes, in a sense, without any hope, we cannot live. And in fact, it's fascinating because I was reading an amazing book called Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. He was a survivor of the Auschwitz concentration camp. And basically, he was saying those who survived the longest in Auschwitz were not necessarily the fittest or the healthiest, but it was those who managed to maintain some degree of hope and purpose in the midst of the hell that they were experiencing. Now, they weren't necessarily all Christians, of course they weren't. So yes, in a sense, in the small scale day-to-day runnings of life, we all have to find hope for tomorrow, and we all find our hope in different things that drives us and gives us a sense of purpose. But what I would say is, whilst that might work when I look on the scale of the next day, week, month, or even the next decade, if I dare to stand back a bit further, not just from the next decade, but think to the next 50 years, or to the next 100 years, or to the next 1,000 years, where does my worldview leave me then? And that's why I use the quote from Bertrand Russell, because actually what Bertrand Russell is saying is, actually, on the grand scheme of things, atheism is bleak, because it says, not only am I going to die, but everyone else is going to die. And yeah, I might contribute something to society and make a difference in this world, but this world's going to be destroyed too. So ultimately, in the grand scheme of things, nothing counts for anything. Now, I might still say, okay, I'm going to try and make a difference now, regardless of that. I'm going to ignore that kind of future reality and make a difference. Of course, I might equally say, well, what the heck? I'll live a nihilistic life and just live for myself, because ultimately it doesn't matter. So it can lead to one or the other, couldn't it? But I think the danger is, or the problem with it is, the only way we can continue to live with a sense of meaning and purpose is not really by thinking about the big picture, not thinking too deeply about those big existential questions. In contrast to that, I'd say as a Christian, I can really ask those big questions and think deeply about it. And when I think about the big picture, rather than taking away a sense of hope and giving a sense of despair, it actually gives an incredible sense of hope and meaning and purpose. And like I said, I think if you look back through the history of the last 2,000 years, you can see plenty of evidence of how that future hope really has transformed people's lives in very real, tangible, and immediate ways too.
Great. For everyone watching, if in any way you feel dissatisfied with Michael's answer and want to come back on him, feel free to pop another question in Slido or Facebook, or even better, join us on the Zoom call afterwards and be able to have more of a proper chat with him through it. Another question here for you, Michael. Religion is on the wrong side of history. It has caused so much conflict, the Crusades, oppression, etc. Isn't a progressive society better off without it?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So wouldn't a progressive society be better off without religion? I guess you could sing along with John Lennon, couldn't you? Imagine a world with no religion. Wouldn't it be wonderful to live in a world like that? And on the one hand, I'd have to be honest and say religion has sometimes caused conflict and violence, and we can't get away from that. And all ideologies have. So non-religious ideologies have too. In fact, if you look at the 20th century, some of the greatest conflicts were caused by ideologies which were at heart, I would say, not religious, but atheistic, but still ideologies. But all ideologies, religious systems, belief systems, whatever you want to call it, can cause conflicts. Would getting rid of religion get rid of conflict? Well, actually, in a study of global conflicts through history, actually the amount of conflicts that have been caused by religion is less than 5%. So actually, whilst it is often commonly put forward by some people like Richard Dawkins and New Atheists, get rid of religion, we'll get rid of conflicts, that doesn't actually bear out when you look at the stats and you look at global history. But I think what I really want to say is what I'm offering and what we're talking about this week is not generic religion, but actually a life-transforming encounter with Jesus Christ. And when you look at any belief system or religion, you have to ask yourself, what would that look like if it was consistently lived out? If someone was to really embrace that and understand that and then live that out, what would it look like? And I look at Jesus, I look at someone who not only said, love your neighbor, but said, love your enemies and do good to those who persecute you. And then I look at Jesus, who not only said that, but then practiced what he preached, as he loved the very people who were crucifying him, forgiving the people who had put him on the cross, and healing one of the soldiers who had come to arrest him. I think, what would it look like for someone to consistently follow Jesus? And I'd say, actually, that would be an incredibly different world. And what Rodney Stark says is, well, actually, that's why Christianity grew so dramatically in the first few centuries, because people saw what it looked like to follow Jesus. What did it look like? It meant to raise the status of women. Now, tragically, so often the institution of the church and religion through history has blinded us to some of the radical, life-transforming teaching and example of Jesus. But I'd want to say, to really understand who Jesus is and to really become a follower of Christ will have a massively transforming impact on the world. So yes, you can look at bad examples, think of the Crusades, think of the Inquisition and so on. You can think of wonderfully good examples, think of Martin Luther King, think of William Wilberforce. But how do we draw the distinction? And I'd say the answer is actually to be more consistent with Jesus, not less. Not to get rid of Christianity, but to really embrace the heart of Christianity and Jesus.
So kind of similar to that question, next one we have in is, how can we have hope if we're constantly hit with more and more bad news, like police brutality, coronavirus, and other things like that? What's hopeful about that?
Yeah, what is hopeful about that? And I think it kind of probably reflects how many of us feel, doesn't it? We look on our phones for hope, and yet I'd suggest if you're looking for hope, looking on the BBC website is not a great place to look, is it? Because actually it's tragic when we look at what's going on. And as more of the events in America unfold, it just makes me more and more depressed for the state, not just of America, but the state of our world. And it can make us feel incredibly despairing. And I think what I'd say is two things. Firstly, as a Christian, I have wonderful hope in the ultimate big picture of things, that the end of the story is wonderful. And although there are some dark, dark chapters in the midst of the story, this isn't heading, as Bertrand Russell says, to the destruction of the universe and bleak, unyielding despair. But actually, as a Christian, I can say the best is yet to come. I look forward to a day when there will be ultimate justice done. I look forward to a day when wrongs are going to be put right, when there is no more racism, when there is no more death, and so on. So that ultimate big picture hope is something which fills me with a great sense of hope in the midst of a world that seems really broken. But I'd also want to say that actually, as I look through history, I see how people who have been embraced by that and transformed by that hope have made a difference. And it also gives me a hope to say, actually, things can change. We often think of history as linear. The world was really, really terrible and we're just getting better. Or, the world was really, really wonderful and we're just getting worse. But often things are quite cyclical. We look back through history and we see, in British history, how 200-300 years ago, in some ways things were incredibly bleak. And then I look back through history and see the transforming impact that a real life-transforming faith in Jesus can have. And the impact that had on a social level in terms of employment law or slavery or those kind of issues, the establishment of hospitals or, education. And I think, no, actually people can make a difference in this world. And so it's not just bury your head in the sand and say it's going to be okay one day. It's saying, actually, that hope also wants me to make a difference today. And whilst ultimately final justice is something which is going to happen in the future, I can still work for justice and change now in the world. And that should motivate me to want to do that.
Great. Fourth question for you. Why do you expect people today to accept a book written by men in power with an agenda 2,000 years ago? It's 2020.
Okay, good questions. Why do I accept a book written by people in power 2,000 years ago? Well, the first and the most substantial reason I would say is because they were not in any way in power. And this is actually what sets the growth of Christianity apart from many other belief systems, certainly apart from the growth of Islam, in that Christianity did not grow on the back of power, certainly not for the first 300 years. For 300 years, the Roman Empire is basically, in waves, persecuting the Christian faith. And so Christianity is not a ticket to power, prestige, and fame and fortune. Christianity is a ticket to suffering, persecution, and martyrdom. And that's basically what the writers of the New Testament faced on the whole. Most of them were willing and did die for their belief. In contrast to that, if I look at, say, the growth of Islam in the 7th century, Islam grew immediately on the back of political power and military expansion. So actually, to embrace the Islamic faith in the 7th century, you could say was convenient in many ways. That doesn't say it is or isn't true. I'm just saying it's more open to that charge. But the fact that Christianity grew not on the back of power, but in the face of persecution, I think is a really compelling reason to take it seriously. And to say, actually, these people were not doing it because they held power. Now, yes, you can say, come the 4th century, Constantine, the Roman Empire, embraces the Christian faith. Christianity then does have political power. But I wouldn't say that was a great day for the Christian church necessarily. In fact, you might say it was the opposite. And it's very important to say that actually all of our texts of the New Testament were written not after Constantine, but before that. And many of our manuscripts for the New Testament also predate Constantine. So this is not some invention of political power that Constantine or any other Roman Empire brought about. This was already established at a time when Christianity was not the route to power, but the route to persecution. So I just say, you've got to ask the question, why do you do that? Why would people do that? I mean, when I was a kid, I used to make up stories. I used to say things like, my sister did it, or the dog ate it, or, it was on fire when I arrived, those kind of stories. And they were always stories to get myself out of trouble, okay? Never once would I make up a story to get myself into trouble. It's just not what you do. So why on earth would these writers make up these stories if, in fact, it led not to, as we said, fame and fortune, but persecution and suffering? I think that's a very compelling reason to start with, to take it seriously. There's a whole lot more we could talk about in terms of the reliability of the Bible and why we can take it seriously historically, but I think that's a great place to start anyway.
Wonderful. So the next question is, why would I want to go to heaven if my friends and family won't be there?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And actually, that's a very personal question. When I was studying in Edinburgh, I had a friend, a much older Christian friend, who had become a Christian in, I think, her mid to late 60s. But she had become a Christian after her husband had already died. And he had lived as a complete atheist through his life, had no kind of Christian faith or commitment, and as far as she knew, died in that way. And one of the big challenges for her was to say, actually, if I embrace the Christian faith and the implications of what I believe as a Christian, that means I'm not going to see my husband again. And that was a real dilemma for her to grapple with. This wasn't a philosophical issue or philosophical question, it was very real. And actually, as she thought about it, she realized that actually, firstly, it was a tragedy that her husband had chosen to reject the forgiveness and the hope that Jesus offers freely to us all. But it would be a double tragedy if, because of his rejection, she was to reject it too. Now you might say, well, how can heaven be heaven? How could I experience joy if those I know and love are not there? I think the thing that I find most helpful to try and answer that, or to think about that, is to think of a story that Jesus told. In one of the Gospels, a Gospel called Luke, Jesus tells this famous story. It's sometimes called the story of the prodigal son, of two boys, actually, not just one, who rebel against their father. The younger one spends all his father's money, leaves home, is a picture basically of the person who lives the kind of licentious life. And then he comes back to his father, says that he's sorry, receives his father's forgiveness, and his father throws this party and welcomes his son home. But then we go, it's like the camera cuts to outside the home, and there's the older brother who's out in the fields. And he hears the party going on, and he gets really, really angry because he's angry at his dad for forgiving his brother. And so his dad comes out and he pleads with him. He says, look, come and enjoy the party. You're welcome too. I want you to be in the party. And he refuses to go in. Now, I would just say two things. Firstly, what more could the father do? You know, he pleads with his son to come into the party and he says no. He can't force him to embrace something which he has chosen to reject. And God doesn't do that with us. He doesn't force us to embrace something which we have chosen to reject, even though that, I would say, is a tragic thing to do. But secondly, imagine if that father then went back into the party and says, hey guys, we're cancelling the party, we're all going home because your brother refuses to join the party. Like, would that be right for them to not rejoice because he doesn't want to join the party? Yes, it's a tragedy that he chooses to reject the invitation, but it'd be a double tragedy if his rejection meant that no one else could experience the joy of the party. And all I would say is that God will not allow the tragedy of people's rejection of this to ultimately ruin and spoil the joy of those who've come to experience it. And that's not being selfish. It's just to say it would be selfish the other way if those who reject it were not just rejecting it for themselves, but then spoiling it for, as it were, everyone. So it's a real one, because I have friends and family who don't follow Jesus, and that's something that makes me sad. But at the same time, I want to say, hey, we have the opportunity to do something about this. This invitation is held out to us. So yeah, even if you've spent your life rejecting Jesus, it doesn't have to stay that way. And the great news is it's not like you have to earn your way in. That's what the younger brother thought. He thought he had to kind of earn his way into his father's acceptance. But actually, the story says, actually, we don't need to. God welcomes us freely if we come to him and we say we're sorry for the way we've lived and we ask him for his forgiveness. He'll do that and we can receive that.
Great. Yeah. Like Michael said, that's a very personal question, very real question for many of us. If you want to follow up on it, please join us on the Zoom call afterwards. You'll have the opportunity, maybe if you feel more comfortable, chatting to someone one-to-one and be able to discuss that a bit more in depth. Next question for you, Michael. What if I'm happy just living this life and accept that death happens and that brings closure?
Yeah, what if I'm happy just living this way and knowing that death is the end? I guess there's two things I could say to that. The first thing I'd say is, whilst that might make you happy, what if death is not the end? What if Jesus rose from the dead? What if that means that actually what I do with Jesus now makes a difference, not just to my life now, but eternally? If that's true, even if that had a chance of being true, that has implications for not just now, but forever. So simply saying, well, I'm kind of happy with the way things are now and not taking that seriously, I would say is a bit of a mistake. I'd love to go into it in more detail. Maybe people want to ask more questions about that later in the Zoom follow-up meeting. But we want to say, look, there are some seriously significant reasons for taking the resurrection of Jesus seriously. And if Jesus rose from the dead, that means death is not the end. And I need to kind of think about what that means to my life. That's the more stark, challenging way to respond to it. Here's another thing I just want to say, though, and that is, what if whilst you are happy with what you have, there is so much more that you couldn't even begin to imagine? I mentioned C.S. Lewis earlier in the Chronicles of Narnia. C.S. Lewis, there's an amazing essay of one of his talks that he gave called The Weight of Glory. And he has this amazing thing in there where he says, when we consider the incredible hope that is offered to us in Jesus, he says, we'll find that actually we're like half-hearted creatures who are content to make mud pies in a slum because we can't imagine what's meant by an offer of a holiday at the seaside. He says we are far too easily pleased. We fool around with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered to us. So I guess the other thing I just want to say is, yeah, you might be happy, and I'm not disagreeing with that. Like, I'm not saying that if you don't live a Christian life, you'll never experience happiness. That's clearly not true. But what if there was a whole dimension to life that you've not even glimpsed? What if there was more to life and a greater purpose to life that you haven't even imagined of yet? What if this big meta-narrative of history is true? What if this is where history is headed? And what if you missed all that? I just want to say, like, it may or may not be true, but it certainly would be worth investigating, because if it is, it has massive, massive implications, and it could make a real difference. Okay.
Yes. So we have 2 questions left on this call, just keeping an eye on the time. But if your
Sure.
question has been put up or you're waiting to hear what you have to say, don't worry, we're going to continue this on Zoom straight after this call. But yeah, we'll just kick off with the second last question. You might even have to refer to some of the books on your wall. This is a big one. Why is there a string on your door?
Oh, that's because on Tuesday it was my wife's birthday, and so I was up until about 1:30 in the morning blowing up balloons that say happy birthday, and then I was trying to dangle them across our living room, but then I was trying to work out how I could get it to stay up, and so it actually goes through the corner of the door and rests on top of the hinge, and then I tied it to the door handle. That is why there's string on my door. So well observed.
Thank you to whoever asked that. Good one.
Glad to hear we're asking life's big questions tonight. Finally, Michael, just to wrap us up, what convinced you, Michael Ots, that Christianity was true?
Yeah, what convinced me? Thanks for that. It's a more personal question. I'm really happy to say, I guess my journey, to give you it in a kind of bit of a nutshell, would be this. I first embraced the Christian faith when I was quite young. I was probably about 7 or 8. I'd had the privilege of being brought up in a family where both my parents by that time had become Christians. And so I heard about Jesus from a young age. I heard the very basics of the Christian faith explained, that Jesus had died so I could be forgiven, that he was alive, and that I could have a relationship with him, and that would not just change my life now, but it would also mean that one day I would be with him. And I just remember thinking, well, that sounds like a good deal. I'll believe that. And I remember going home and praying and asking the Lord Jesus to do that for me. And over a period of time, I came to the realization that had happened, that was real. But I grew up in Leicester, and Leicester, you may or may not know, in the Midlands of England, was the first city to have an ethnic majority. That means there's more people from a non-British background living in Leicester than from a kind of historically white British background. So that means that there's lots of different belief systems, Muslim, Hindu, Sikh, you name it, you find it in Leicester. And actually, because I went to an all-boys school that was a pretty comprehensive school in every meaning of the word, it was full of quite a lot of people who said, well, we don't believe anything, we're just atheists. And it was a fascinating dynamic to go into, because in my teenage years, I suddenly started saying to myself, well, why do I believe this? Is this just because I happen to be born into a Christian family? And if I'd been born in an atheist family, would I be an atheist? And if I'd been born in a Muslim family, maybe I'd be a Muslim, and so on. So what we did is we actually started a Christian union, a bit like the ones in universities, apart from it was much smaller, because there was only 3 of us in the school who called themselves Christian. So I was the president, my friend was the vice president, and the other guy was the secretary, and we used to meet every week and study the Bible. But then we decided we'd hold an event where we'd basically just invite anyone to come and ask any questions that they like about the Christian faith. And then we asked an older Christian friend from our local church to come and respond to the questions. We advertised it right across the school. And I'll never forget, we sat in this religious education classroom. The teacher was nowhere to be seen. There was about 70 kids sitting in this room, throwing bananas across the room and smoking stuff out the back window and so on. And I remember thinking, gosh, this is going to be terrible. I'm going to look like a complete idiot, because there's no way in this kind of environment, this Christian from my church is going to be able to make anything sound at all reasonable. And I'll never forget what happened, because basically he stood at the front and responded to question after question after question, some of them hostile, many of them quite ridiculing, really, of the Christian faith. But he answered them in a way that was reasonable and warm and intelligent and sometimes humorous. And I remember sitting there thinking to myself, actually, this seems to stack up. You know, it doesn't fall apart when you start analyzing it and questioning it. Actually, it seems to stand up to this kind of questioning, even hostile questioning. And that encouraged me, rather than saying, well, I'll kind of bury my head in the sand and just kind of continue to believe what I've always believed, to actually stand as a Christian and say, if this is true, if this is worth basing my life on, this has to stand up to reasoning and questioning. And actually, I don't need to be afraid of that. And so that's what I've tried to do ever since that day, to embrace the questions, the objections that might come at Christianity and say, does it really make sense? And does it really stack up? And what I've found is the more and more I've done that, the more and more compelled and convinced I've become that it really does. And as I've worked in universities around the UK and in other parts of the world, I've seen actually Christianity does make reasonable sense. It explains away the historical evidence in a way that is reasonable, but it also explains away my experiences of life in a way that nothing else does. It does have explanatory power. And so I would say that's how I first came to believe it. But the reason why I still believe it today is because I'm convinced it's true. I'm convinced it's wonderfully good news. And I've seen the wonderful, incredible and powerful difference it's made, not just in my life, but in many other people's lives around our world. And I'm really convinced of that.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael, for giving up your time this evening to come and speak to us. That's the official end of the stream for tonight. Like I said a lot, there will be a Zoom call straight after this to allow you to engage more directly with questions and discussions about tonight's talk. So there should be a link for that on the Facebook page. Again, like I said, if you want to go further than just this week to explore the Bible and Christian faith more, we should have a link to a program that will allow you to have access to part of the Bible and to get in touch with someone from one of the Christian unions to go through that with you. I think there should be a short video after the stream as well, giving you more details for that. So again, thank you so much, Michael, for being with us. Thank you for everyone tuning in. Great to have you, and we'll see you very soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hi, we're from the Scottish Christian Unions, and we just want to say a big thanks for being part of some of our events this week. If you've enjoyed them, here's another opportunity to continue some of the conversations begun at events, to develop some answers to questions you might have, or just to talk to someone who's happy to listen. If you can, please fill out the form via the link in this post to allow us to get in contact with you. Also, we would love it if you could join our weekly Zoom call commencing on Tuesday the 2nd of June at 8 p.m. to read the book Uncover Mark. This is a great way to build a picture of who Jesus is as you explore who he met and the life he led. This might help you to develop your own opinion of Christianity along the way. Maybe it will help you to make sense of life's big questions. Or maybe it will provide a sense of hope in the midst of COVID-19. Or maybe it'll be a new way to spend your Tuesday evenings. We'd love to hear from you anyway, and so why not come and see for yourself?